Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. And thanks, of course, to the Miller Committee and to the Center for Advanced Study and to the many units who contributed to funding this event, whose names you can see on the CAS flyer that's been posted around campus and that was passed out at the entry to the room today. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Sugrue, the Edmund J. and Louis W. Kahn Professor of History and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. A specialist in 20th century American politics, urban history, and race relations, Professor Sugrue is the author of The Origins of the Urban Crisis, which won no fewer than, and actually a bit more than, 8 awards, including the prestigious Bancroft Prize in American History, the Philip Taft Prize in Labor History, and the President's Book Award of the Social Science History Association. An outstanding analysis of Detroit, the book is also listed as one of Princeton University Press's 100 most influential books of the past 100 years. In addition, Sugrue is co-editor of W.E.B. Du Bois and the Race and the City, The Philadelphia Negro and Its Legacy from 1998, and of the New Suburban History just from 2006. He's also published more than 30 articles on a wide range of topics, including modern American culture and politics, affirmative action, 20th century conservatism and liberalism, race, urban economic development, poverty and public policy, and colonial American history. The winner of fellowships and grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Fletcher Foundation, Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, the American Philosophical Society, and many more, Sugrue is also the recipient of Penn's Richard Dunn Teaching Award in the Department of History, and 2 of his courses have been selected as Hall of Fame classes by the Penn Course Review, and this should come as no surprise to the 15 or 16 students who spent 3 hours with him at lunch today in a wonderful conversation. He also combines scholarly research and civic engagement, working for the Philadelphia Historical Commission, serving as an expert witness for the University of Michigan in the 2 federal lawsuits concerning affirmative action, and he serves on the board of the Bread and Roses Community Fund, supporting grassroots organizations working for racial and economic equality. Professor Sugrue is currently finishing a book titled Sweet Land of Liberty, The Unfinished Struggle for Racial Equality in the North, and is also writing a history of 20th century America with Glenda Gilmore, among other projects. He's also writing an essay that focuses on race in Levittown, Pennsylvania, a subject that's near and dear to my heart since I'm editing that volume that he's contributing to, that will be published by the University of Pittsburgh Press, that I hope you'll all look for in a couple of years. And today, his lecture is titled Jim Crow's Last Stand, The Struggle for Racial Equality in the Suburban North. So please help me welcome Professor Tom Sugrue.
Lots of papers up here. I'm going to clear them out of my way before we start. I want to thank Mark and especially Diane for the kind introduction, and to thank you all for coming out on what is a really nice day. Maybe I'll be around for the Chiefs' last dance coming up soon. It's been an interesting business to watch from afar. I have just finished a book on the history of the Black freedom struggle, the struggle for racial equality in the North in the 20th century. And it's a topic that I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of today, but I really want to situate it in a larger context and then kind of move maybe from the macro down to the micro. When I started working on the history of civil rights in the North, I embarked on this project with grappling with a paradox. That is, why is it more than a half century after the African-American freedom struggle really took off in the United States, and you'll notice I'm pushing the chronology backward and also pushing it forward, why is it that, say, 60 years after the extraordinary outburst of grassroots protest during and immediately following the Second World War, why is it that a half century after the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, more than 40 years after the passage of the landmark civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Open Housing Act of 1968, why is it that in the aftermath of these extraordinary shifts in the terrain of civil rights in the United States, why is it that patterns of racial inequality remain so deeply entrenched in the United States? And why is it, indeed, that those patterns remain especially deeply entrenched in the North, not in the place that we ordinarily associate with the highlights of the African-American freedom struggle? To answer this question requires exploring the virtually unknown history of the African-American freedom struggle in the North. I'm writing what I call a premature synthesis, a book that is attempting to tie together 70 or 80 years worth of history, only bits and pieces of which are known by others than a few dissertators and some local historians. My very list of the laws and the landmarks of the last 50 or 60 years suggest how much has changed in race relations in the United States over the last half century or more, and indeed how much has changed for the better. Over the course of the last half century or so, we've witnessed some extraordinary gains in race relations. For example, the expansion of the African-American middle class, the number of African-American students in classes at major universities, places that they were almost completely excluded from even 30 or 40 years ago. There's been an extraordinary expansion in the number of African-American elected officials and in the role of government in particular as what one civil rights activist in the 1960s called as the most effective civil rights organization in the country for promoting the gains of African-Americans. If we look retrospectively over the last 60 years, we can, I think, come away with a certain optimism about the ways in which race relations and civil rights have changed in the United States and changed for the better. But we still have to come back to some of the paradoxes, some of the things that haven't changed. And the North, in particular, is a chastening reminder of how far we still have to go. It's in the North, not in the South, where the patterns of racial segregation remain most persistent. 23 of the 25 most segregated metropolitan areas in the United States today are in the North. Here are the top 10: Detroit, Gary, Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Newark, New York City, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. Maybe St. Louis isn't in the North, maybe it's in the South or it's on the border, but suffice it to say, this is a list of the most segregated places in the United States, and they're all north of the Mason-Dixon line. Yet we don't have any good explanations of why this is the case. The history of the struggle for racial equality in the North has been almost completely overshadowed by the voluminous body of scholarship on the Southern movement. The vast majority of the near library, and it really is almost a library, of books and articles on the history of civil rights focuses on the South, and I would argue to the great detriment of our understanding of race relations in modern America. The commonplace histories of civil rights, the ones that are taught to us from elementary and high school on forward, and indeed in many college classes, the commonplace histories of civil rights begin in 1954 or 1955. With Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision that struck down separate and unequal education, or 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, the extraordinary grassroots movement that began an important phase of the Southern freedom struggle. Our stories of the civil rights movement in the United States are usually told in a compelling narrative that centers around the life of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, most closely associated with King, and culminate in the abolition of de jure Jim Crow and the passage of the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s. The story of the Southern movement, the Southern freedom struggle, especially what some historians call the classic phase of the civil rights movement, this 55 to mid-1960s period, is at heart a morality tale with deep political implications. And befitting morality tales, it hinges on a number of binary oppositions that ultimately obscure more than they reveal. For example, nonviolence versus violence. Color blindness versus color consciousness, integration versus separation, or in convenient shorthand, Martin, that is Martin Luther King Jr., versus Malcolm, that is Malcolm X. This conventional narrative of the civil rights movement has two endings. The happy one, that the civil rights legislation of the 1960s profoundly altered race relations in the United States for the better. The other, the unhappy one, and sometimes they go hand in hand, sees the North as the tragic denouement of the civil rights movement, or the movement, it is said, went north to Chicago or to Boston or to Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and New York. The movement, it is said, went north, and there it crashed onto the shoals of black power, identity politics, and the urban riots. The history of the black freedom struggle in the North before 1965 is still a tale that's been told very thinly. Indeed, for many subjects, it's virtually non-existent. And while I don't want to for a moment diminish the accomplishments of the historians, the social scientists, and journalists who've written compellingly about the Southern movement, to put a point on it, the story of racial inequality in the North and the struggles against it, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s and continuing through the present day. The story of racial inequality and the struggles against it in the North greatly complicates our understanding of race relations in America's ongoing racial crisis. How we remember the past has real stakes for the present, and our nostalgia for the civil rights era, our after-the-fact identification with the civil rights struggle in the South, obscures more than it reveals. By commemorating the history of the Southern freedom struggle, by talking about how far we have overcome, by denigrating the Northern struggle for racial equality with its successes as well as its failures, we collectively let ourselves off the hook. My new book takes the North as its focal point and explores the still largely unwritten history of the grassroots struggle for racial equality involving blacks and whites, leftists and liberals, activists who are secular, activists who are religious, who collectively transformed race in modern America, but whose struggles remain partial, incomplete, unfinished. The battle for racial equality in the North took place on many fronts, which I explore in my new project. And I'm just going to give you a little glimpse of some of the fronts before I begin to zoom down and focus on one. In the 1930s and 1940s, and continuing in some places into the 60s, activists throughout the North challenged segregated public accommodations, movie theaters, restaurants, hotels, amusement parks, just to name a few. African Americans were systematically excluded from these public accommodations even when many northern states and localities had laws forbidding that discrimination. This was a campaign that came to its fruition in the 1950s and to a great extent became a training ground for activists who then were involved in the more well-known and celebrated struggles to open up public accommodations like lunch counters in the South in the late 1950s and especially in the early 1960s. Another thread of activism. Throughout the period from the 1930s to the 1970s, labor and civil rights activists targeted economic restructuring and workplace discrimination, from the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns of the 1930s, where black activists boycotted firms that didn't hire African Americans, to the March on Washington movement during the Second World War, where African Americans demanded inclusion in America's booming wartime economy, to the 30-year battle for state anti-discrimination laws in the North between the 1940s and the 1960s, to the grassroots protests and activism that led to the rise of the policy that we call affirmative action. Another thread of activism, beginning in the 1940s but coming to a peak in the 1960s and 1970s and indeed beyond, grassroots activists in nearly every major northern city and many smaller places as well protested against the police and against inequities in the criminal justice system, inequities that only grew greater during the law and order climate of the 1960s, the 1970s, and beyond. It is enormously important in understanding the history of race and civil rights politics in the United States to grapple with law and order politics, the way that they're gendered and the way that they shaped politics in northern cities, especially during the uprisings of the 1960s. One of the most interesting, important, and almost completely unknown stories, it was unknown to me when I started working on this book, and I started to uncover it in the black press and in various civil rights organizations' records. Almost completely unknown are the stories of grassroots African American struggles for racial equality and education, most of which played out in small towns and suburbs before moving to the better-known terrain of the major cities. These were battles that began in some places in the 1920s and 1930s, really began to take off during and after the Second World War, and really changed the terrain of the debate about education in the United States before the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision. And these played out in such unlikely places as Berwyn, Willow Grove, and Chester, Pennsylvania, Toms River, Englewood, Mapleshade, New Jersey, Hilburn and New Rochelle and Hempstead, New York, Hillsborough and Dayton and Shaker Heights, Ohio. I could go on and list these places. They were rent asunder, these communities, by black-led grassroots boycotts against separate and unequal education, profoundly changing the terrain of the African-American freedom struggle in this period. Indeed, the conventional story that we tell about education, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and its attorneys, the NAACP and its attorneys, foisting an integrationist policy on grassroots communities who had different ideas about schools, is subverted by the story of grassroots agitation for equal education. Indeed, throughout the North, grassroots activists forced the hand of the NAACP to pay attention to Northern racial equalities and profoundly shaped and reshaped the litigation strategy of that well-known civil rights organization. It's a really interesting story. Civil rights activists also, beginning in the 1930s and weaving throughout the period from the 1930s on forward, struggled for African-American self-determination, particularly in terms of control of territory and control of economic institutions in urban neighborhoods, one that came to its culmination in an interesting and ironic marriage between African-American radical activists and Republicans in the 1970s over the issue of community economic development, a rich and complicated story that I won't tell today. Of all the civil rights battles in the North, perhaps none was more consequential than the battle against the multiple reinforcing inequalities of race and place, specifically the battle to open up the housing market, and specifically to open up suburbia to African Americans, which is going to be my focus today. I should say, just as a quick aside, that what you're hearing, I think you've gotten a sense of from my description of some of the other things I'm writing about. This is really, I would call, a shard of this very large, sweeping project that spans a 70-plus year period. And in some ways, especially for those of you interested in the African-American history side of things, this is the whitest part of my entire book. The vast majority of the stuff I write about in this book deals with whites almost as co-partners at best, and oftentimes as kind of marginal, because most whites in the North for most of the 20th century didn't give a damn about African-American civil rights and were not involved even marginally in the movement. But this is one that happened to involve quite a few whites. Of all of the changes that remade America in the 20th century, few were more momentous and few had more enduring effects than the mass migration of whites to suburbia. Northern suburbia is a particularly revealing place to examine the history of civil rights because it's there that black-white segregation has been the most persistent and intractable, and remains to today the most persistent and intractable. Despite more than half a century of a liberalization of white attitudes about race, integration, and housing, the degree of racial separation in most northern metropolitan areas and in suburbs would have pleased all but the most intransigent architects of Jim Crow. Post-war suburbanization mattered because it simultaneously created and reinforced racial inequalities on several different levels. And let me lay them out. First, it created racially segregated real estate markets underwritten by federal housing and tax policy, supported by private real estate practices, and sustained by individual and collective action. And those of you, I've written about this extensively in my earlier work, and we'll just mention it very briefly here. A wide range of sociological studies have shown that where you live, what the value of your real estate is the primary determinant of most Americans' wealth. Even more at mid-century than today. So the racial division of real estate markets had material consequences for African Americans and their household wealth. To give you a quick snapshot of that difference, and I can come back to it later, African American households on average today have a household wealth 1/10, 10% of that of whites, largely because of racial differentials in the real estate market. So housing opportunity mattered in that realm. Secondly, in a period of the massive decentralization of commerce and industry, a process that coincided with massive white suburbanization, where you lived determined to a great extent your access to jobs and the consumer marketplace. So opening up the housing market mattered in terms of the access to employment. Next, and perhaps most importantly, the localistic political organization of the North gave suburbanites, white suburbanites in particular, disproportionate access to political goods and resources. By that I mean the quality of schools, your public services, your infrastructure, and how much you paid for it in the form of taxes. Suburbanization, the process of white suburbanization, could be seen, to borrow a concept from the sociologist Charles Tilly, suburbanization could be seen as a form of opportunity hoarding. That is, the creation of a spatial niche that agglomerated public and private goods to the disproportionate benefit of whites and to the disproportionate disadvantage of African Americans. In this context of multiple reinforcing inequalities, that is, the gap in wealth, access to employment, and the way that we distribute our political goods locally in the United States, and suburbanization allowing African American whites to hoard and benefit disproportionately from political resources and goods. In this context, integrating suburbia, opening up metropolitan housing markets, was a political act with very high stakes. The struggle to open up the suburbs began in the 1940s and 1950s, and it was deeply shaped and constrained, I would contend, by Cold War era understandings of race, rights, and inequality. The battle to open up suburbs coincided with a really critical shift that I write about in how civil rights activists, especially in the North, thought about the problems of race and inequality in the United States. This period, especially following World War II, was a critical juncture in the ways that academics and intellectuals, as well as activists, thought about the root causes of racial inequality. From the mid-1930s through the late 1940s, a remarkable left liberal coalition of activist intellectuals, a coalition that included blacks and whites, the left wing of the Democratic Party, small and capital S socialists, a smattering of one world Republicans, mostly in the circle of Wendell Willkie, trade unionists, especially in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and communists. All of these proffered a political economic interpretation of racial inequality. Specifically, they argued that racial inequality was the result of an unequal or asymmetrical power relationship between blacks and whites, particularly in the economy and in America's political institutions, and that to transform race relations in the United States meant to transform political and economic institutions simultaneously. This became the primary locus of civil rights activism during the Great Depression and during World War II. But this changed in the late 1940s. A combination of the Cold War, a growing orthodoxy about free enterprise and individualism, and a post-war American triumphalism, a sense of America's exceptionalism in the world, led to these political and economic understandings of race and inequality to be shunted to the side, and an individualistic and moralistic understanding of racial inequality to move to the center. That individualistic and moralistic understanding of racial inequality that has its roots deeper in American history but really becomes prominent in the 1940s and the 1950s shaped the open housing movement, and indeed is probably the most important legacy of the civil rights movement of that era to the America that we live in today, and I can return more to that later. The key to this Cold War era civil rights effort was that it viewed racial inequality as a moral and psychological problem. Or, in the most oft-quoted formulation of this, Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote the best-selling book, An American Dilemma, in 1944. And it's an amazing book, 2 volumes. Most people did not read Gunnar Myrdal from cover to cover, but the book became a Bible for civil rights activists in this period. The African-American press, religious publications, popular journals, magazines, op-ed pieces, speeches, and sermons drew from Myrdal quite liberally, usually from the very conveniently italicized passages in Gunnar Myrdal that basically gave you the bullet point summaries of his major arguments in a way that you could take home and whip into a slogan or a sermon or a sign. The most quoted section of Gunnar Myrdal, it's so quoted it's almost a cliche, but it matters. "The Negro problem," wrote Myrdal, "the Negro problem is a problem in the heart of the American. It is there that the decisive struggle goes on. What Myrdal meant was not a problem in the heart of the American, but a problem in the heart of the white American. Civil rights activism, shaped by this moral and psychological understanding of civil rights, looked towards efforts to convert, to persuade, to transform, to educate white Americans, to persuade them that their racial prejudices were irrational. Racial liberals, building on Myrdal and drawing from the social sciences, especially from a booming literature on prejudice in survey research and social psychology and political science, saw racial inequality as a result of a fundamentally irrational and pathological set of ideas, a manifestation of personality traits that came to be called the authoritarian personality, those that had led to the rise, it was said, of totalitarianism. To overcome these psychological and moral deficiencies required a program of education, persuasion, and conversion. And beginning in the late 1940s, civil rights activists throughout the North, and the South too, developed a multi-pronged approach to opening up the suburbs that drew from this moral and psychological framework for thinking about racial inequality. Above all, Northern activists hoped to persuade whites of the fundamental humanity of blacks, or as the slogan went at the time, that Negro and white are all alike beneath the skin. Part of this effort involved publicity. Advocates of civil rights and racial equality worked especially through religious organizations, and the churches became a major vehicle. And I have a lot of interesting material that I won't give you here about the role that especially Jewish and Protestant congregations played in professing the message of racial equality and trying to convert their members to accept the fundamental humanity of blacks. There's a very interesting story here about what I call marketing integration in an age of mass culture, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly here. Civil rights advocates placed articles and worked with sympathetic journalists in major national news magazines and increasingly in Hollywood to promote the idea of racial equality, to challenge irrational prejudices. For example, when a black family moved peacefully into Ashburton, Maryland, a suburb of Baltimore in 1959, the Saturday Evening Post ran a story entitled, "A Negro Moved Next to Me," touting the fact that property values didn't plummet even in a prosperous suburb when blacks moved in. There were stories like this all over the place in religious periodicals and mainstream publications. These publications made their case for integration not just through text but also through image. And if I had a slide here, just imagine it for a moment, the ubiquitous photographs that showed up accompanying these articles and in brochures that were prepared by civil rights groups, disseminated at rallies and in churches and in many other places. Picture postcard view of post-Second World War II American suburbia, 2 adjoining houses with a white picket fence running down the middle, black mother and her children standing on one side, white mother and her children standing on the other side, chalking, the kids frolicking together on the lawn. Or another pretty common photograph, one that showed the inside of a typical suburban kitchen, cake out on a plate, coffee pot, a couple of coffee mugs, and black and white housewife sitting and chatting. In other words, attempts to market integration by showing whites that African Americans were really just like them. They shared common aspirations, they were middle class, and they weren't, as popular mythology had it, frightening. Well, the images, the marketing, was premised on the argument that if whites saw that black homeowners kept up their houses, maintained their gardens, and lived quiet bourgeois lives, whites would see the irrationality of their prejudices, and the idea of racial integration would take hold. The effect of these efforts through periodicals, through films, and there were a whole slew of films that were produced in this period that were disseminated quite widely to promote this message, that were shown in union halls, that were shown in church basements, and so on. Sermon guides that were prepared and distributed by all the mainstream congregations. The effect of these efforts to reshape public opinion were, to put it bluntly, stunning. Northern activists through the campaign to market integration, decisively delegitimated overt racial prejudice in a very short period of time. In 1942, only a little more than 1/3 of northern whites approved of having even a single black neighbor. And most in the 1940s expressed their negative opinions of blacks rather bluntly. They used overtly racist terminology. By 1963, not even 20 years or 21 years later, by 1963, 70% of northern whites expressed support for having a black neighbor. Whites professed in all sorts of surveys that they were indeed now colorblind, that they cared not about the skin color of their neighbor, but rather about other attributes like their ability to keep up a property or their values or their economic status. But even if this attitudinal shift, and it can't be downplayed, it's really significant, if this attitudinal shift was unprecedented in scope and scale, translating professed belief into practice proved to be much, much, much more difficult. Or maybe to put it most cynically, perhaps white Americans were unwilling to express to pollsters and survey researchers and social scientists what they still believed, and hence there's a gap between what people said and what they actually believed. Or perhaps there was something else that made it difficult to translate belief into practice. I should say, just as another quick aside, that the story here about the shift in discourse, the shift in the ways in which people publicly spoke about race in the United States, especially white people, in a very short period of time, is a chastening reminder, especially to people who focus on culture as a vehicle for political transformation, that changing what people think or feel or profess or the way they talk about something doesn't necessarily, indeed maybe doesn't very often translate into more substantive material political change. Well, I now want to move from the abstract, from this big picture, down to the concrete. And I'm going to focus for the next few minutes on a specific case. And it's a case that brought Diane and me together, and it's one about the battle to open up Levittown, specifically the battle to open up Levittown, Pennsylvania. Well, I focus on Levittown because of its iconic status in post-Second World War II American history. Go to any book on America in the 1950s, anyone. Go to any textbook on modern American history, and you'll find a photograph of Levittown with its kidney-shaped cul-de-sacs and curvilinear streets and little look-alike houses. It's so iconic. The Levittown story shows up so often, so frequently, but it actually doesn't get usually interrogated very deeply. But I should say that Levittown is just a shard of my new project. I focus on Levittown in the context of battles to open up housing in really diverse northern places like Cicero and Deerfield, Illinois, which actually figures quite prominently in my new book. Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, an ostensibly liberal, Quaker-dominated college town that actually battled quite ferociously against African Americans moving into their all-white suburb in the late 1950s. Great Neck, New York, Dearborn, Michigan, Livonia, Michigan, just to name a few. But no place symbolized the promise of post-Second World War II America more than Levittown. It was an icon nationally and internationally of post-Second World War II American economics and culture. Affordable housing for the common man, the mass-produced houses of Levittown, remade the American landscape after the Second World War, both directly and indirectly through their countless imitators. William Levitt, the master builder, celebrated the distinctive Americanness of Levittown. It was a place where middle Americans could own their own homes and move into the American mainstream. Levitt was a crusader. He saw his communities as a bulwark against communism. Indeed, as he put it in another quote that shows up all the time, all over the place, no man who owns his own home and lot can be a communist. So Levitt was in some ways a Cold War crusader. Of course, what Levitt didn't know, and what we'll see in a few minutes, is that the Levittowns actually had quite a few communists living in them, and they wreaked quite a bit of havoc, especially around the issue of civil rights and racial equality. But Levitt saw himself as having devised an ingenious solution to the post-Second World War II American housing shortage, and saw himself as really someone who was providing great opportunities to ordinary Americans. But his altruism, his vision, ended there. He was unabashed in defending the racial homogeneity of his planned communities. "We can solve a housing problem," said Levitt. "We can solve a housing problem, or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two." Levitt, because of his visibility and prominence, became a natural target for civil rights protesters. In 1949, a group of New York civil rights activists lobbied the federal government to try to get it to refuse to underwrite, to provide financial underwriting for mortgages in the first Levittown on Long Island, and demanded that the local administrator of the Federal Housing Administration, who was responsible for working with developers to subsidize them, demand that Levitt adopt a non-discrimination policy. They failed. Unchecked by the Federal Housing Administration, Levitt defended racial segregation in his new community. In 1950, his firm launched eviction proceedings against two families who rented homes in the New York Levittown, the Noviks and the Rosses. I'm pretty sure, and have non-verifiable, unfortunately, recollections on this one, that the Noviks and Rosses were both communists. They had committed the unpardonable sin of inviting the children of some black friends to play in their yard. Under the terms of the restrictive covenants that covered Levittown, the use of these premises by persons other than Caucasians was forbidden. Lawyers from the NAACP intervened when the Noviks and Rosses were evicted, but the case was thrown out of court on a technicality. In the meantime, Levitt announced plans for a new racially segregated Levittown outside of Philadelphia, a metropolitan area that between 1945 and 1953 had seen a huge housing boom. But in that period, between 1945 and 1953, only 347 out of more than 120,000 newly built homes, 347 out of 120,000 newly built homes were open to African Americans. In the summer of 1951, when plans for the Pennsylvania Levittown went public, Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, sent a telegram to the Truman administration, to the FHA, and to the Pennsylvania governor, demanding that this Levittown be opened up to buyers regardless of their race. But the federal and state officials refused to intervene in what they considered to be a private or market matter. In 1954, as construction began on the new Pennsylvania Levittown, the NAACP pushed the Eisenhower administration to stop the federal underwriting of what they called Jim Crow Levittowns. In this case, however, the Eisenhower administration was not particularly sympathetic, especially on housing issues, to the demands of civil rights organizations, and they rebuffed the entreaties. In the spring of 1955, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, fresh off of its victory in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of a group of black veterans who charged Levitt with discrimination. It was a case that was led by two of the NAACP's great attorneys, Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, who later became a judge. And they charged that Levitt's refusal to sell home to blacks violated the 14th Amendment and Pennsylvania law. The suit also brought in the Federal Housing Administration and the federal agent, who underwrote the Levitt's developments, but it went nowhere. The court, the federal judge in the case issued a very terse opinion that essentially just completely dismissed the NAACP's arguments that the federal and state governments could not be held responsible for discrimination in Levittown. He was a private developer. Discrimination was not the consequence or the result of state action. While the NAACP was unsuccessful in its battle through the courts to open up Levittown to African Americans, grassroots activists were working quietly and behind the scenes to undermine this discriminatory development. Watching Levitt, unbeknownst to him, were a small band of Quaker activists committed to bringing down the invisible walls of race. Levitt had plunked his Pennsylvania Levittown right down in the middle of the Quakers' ancestral home, southeastern Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was, and the Quakers would recoil at me saying this, but Philadelphia was the Quaker Vatican, the home of the American Friends Service Committee, which had won the Nobel Prize in 1947 for its refugee work in war-torn Europe, was tied in with every major left-wing and civil rights and labor organization in the period, an extraordinary organization worthy of a whole history, actually. It's amazing to me at how little it's been studied. Just as a quick aside, the American Friends Service Committee, the activist branch of the Quakers, was involved in desegregation efforts in the South in the 40s and in early 1950s. When Prince Edward County, Virginia, the county that shut down its public school system to resist Brown versus Board of Education and turned all of its public schools into private academies for whites, when it did that in 1957, the American Friends Service Committee, or 1958, the American Friends Service Committee actually started a mission to bring African American children from Prince Edward County to northern school districts so that they could get an education that they were being denied by the public authorities in their home county. It's an amazing organization with an amazing history. Well, the Quakers were there in southeastern Pennsylvania, and the Quakers had their eye on Levitt right from the get-go, and they began in 1953 to hold secret meetings to figure out a way to crack open Levittown. They began to plot what they called a move-in. What the Quakers discovered was this: it was possible to find a few whites who were willing to sell. The Quakers quickly found themselves in the company of CIO activists and communists who were living in Levittown, who were quite sympathetic to their goal. But it was very difficult to find what they called black pioneers to move in. Between 1953 and 1957, the Quakers interviewed dozens of what they called prospects. They even went so far, and I love this is one of the great little details that you can only uncover because the Quakers left amazing records. They were so detailed. They're a gold mine for historians doing research because they have a record of journal keeping. So they have these really long and detailed, meeting with a black prospect, and it's like 3 pages, single-spaced, describing the meeting in great detail. But they even went so far as to go to Fort Dix, New Jersey, to recruit African Americans in the military. And the Quakers are a traditional peace church. They oppose to military service. But they knew that African American soldiers, A, had experience with the only significantly integrated institution other than certain CIO unions in the United States in the mid-1950s, and B, that African American soldiers would not be perceived as threatening or scary in a way that other African Americans might to northern whites. Their efforts kept getting rebuffed. Blacks interviewed were afraid of being isolated. They were afraid of violence and harassment. They were afraid of being the first blacks or the only blacks in the community. In a revealing memo, one of the Quaker activists wrote, "Do members of minority groups feel integration has concrete personal advantage for them?" The implied answer was no. Quote, "Those who act in the absence of concrete personal incentives are the pioneers, and there are not many of them in any group." The Quakers worked with the NAACP and worked with housing organizations in Philadelphia to try to reach out through subterranean channels to recruit African Americans to move into Levittown. And through an indirect connection, finally in 1957, William and Daisy Myers came forward as willing buyers. The housing market was slow in 1957. The country was in a pretty serious recession. And the house at the corner of Dogwood Drive and Deep Green Lane, owned by a white family willing to sell to blacks, the house had been on the market for almost 2 years. The Myerses were exactly the sort of pioneers that the activists had been looking for. They were both in their mid-30s. He was a World War II veteran and a refrigeration technician, although interestingly he was described as an engineer in many of the letters and articles that went out at the time to make him seem even more bourgeois and respectable than a mere refrigeration technician. They had lived in Bristol Township and were active in civic affairs. And like most Levittown families, they were baby boomer parents. They had a newborn, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. On August 13th, 1957, the Myers family moved into their 3-bedroom ranch. Daisy Myers described the move-in terms that were really kind of expressive of suburban aspirations. She was looking forward, she told an interviewer, to having a little space for flowers in the yard. But she would have no time to garden, and when her husband, William Myers, went out to garden in an act of calculated defiance at the white resistance that had ensued, he actually went out with his rifle from the Second World War, using the bayonet to weed. A real great act, actually, of kind of assertion in the face of what became an onslaught of white resistance. A several-week siege followed the Myers move-in. Hundreds of angry whites gathered in front of the house, picketing, protesting under the cover of darkness. Many of the Myers windows were broken. Police officers and protesters, white protesters, faced off on the streets. Opponents of the move-in sprayed, painted KKK on the house of the next-door neighbors, who did happen to be communists and who were staunch supporters of the Myers and had been working with civil rights groups behind the scenes to help facilitate the move-in into the community. Another white supporter of the Myers had a cross burned on his lawn, and the owner of a vacant house next door to the Myers allowed his property to be used as what one reporter called an anti-integration social club, a base of operations for a war on nerves on the Myers and their supporters, blasting music, hanging Confederate flags, and trying to bother the Myers out of their house. In the last lack of indignity, Myers' insurance company canceled their homeowners insurance policy in the middle of all of this, leading the Quakers and the NAACP to work through various channels, finally finding a labor-based insurance agency in New York City to grant them an insurance policy in case their house were damaged or destroyed by vandals. The grounds for opposing the Myers were varied. It was a mix of identity and self-interest. Fears that the presence of blacks in the neighborhood, many feared that the presence of blacks in the neighborhood would lower property values. One white neighbor candidly told the reporter, "Bill Myers is probably a nice guy, but every time I look at him, I see $2,000 drop off the value of my house." The Cold War Association of Civil Rights and Communism also hindered the goal of racial integration in Levittown. The pastor of the large local Catholic parish, and a lot of Levittown residents were Catholic, viewed the Myers move-in as part of a communist plot. And the fact that there were people who were known to be on the political left involved only seemed to give sustenance to that argument. Even a group of moderates, organized as the Citizens Committee of Levittown, labeled the Myers supporters as a group of subversives. Levittown dampened the post-war, the Myrdalian optimism about civil rights. For above all, the Levittown story was widely publicized in the white and in the African-American press. And it came to serve for many African Americans as confirmation of all of their worst fears, confirmation of the illiberality of northern whites, and confirmation of the grave personal risks that would come if you dared cross the invisible racial boundaries. And as Levittown stories circulated widely, blacks began to ask and continue to ask whether or not integration was worth it, even though in principle, and in terms of what they told survey research, an overwhelming majority of African Americans in the 60s and 1970s supported the goals of housing integration. Indeed, by an 8-to-1 majority in the late 1960s and early 1970s, blacks supported the goal of housing integration. Levittown did not attract a flood of black buyers in the aftermath of the Myers move-in. A second black family moved in the spring of 1958. But the Myers themselves moved from the neighborhood in 1959. Even when Levittown had quieted down, the experience of the Myers served as a chilling reminder of the difficulties of racial integration in the North. Opening the suburbs was a fragile and difficult task that exacted a high price from both the pioneers and from their white supporters. Well, while this was happening, ever sensitive to the market and insensitive to civil rights protests, William Levitt announced plans to build a third racially segregated Levittown just a short distance away in the suburbs of South New Jersey, in Willingboro, New Jersey. Levitt's attorneys fought, but in this case, the NAACP prevailed in court. Housing developments under New Jersey's recently enacted civil rights laws, part of a whole story of grassroots activism in New Jersey in the 1940s and 1950s. New Jersey law required that housing developments be open to all buyers under law, regardless of race, creed, and color. From the outset, Levittown, New Jersey was integrated. But the Levitts, ever good capitalists, quickly discovered that there was a large pent-up black demand for new housing and began gradually to market that Levittown and other suburban developments to African American buyers. By the 1970s and 1980s, Levittown, New Jersey had become the black Levittown, a place that already by 1970 was 11% black, and by 1980 was more than a third black, and today has a black majority. Here, unlike in Pennsylvania and unlike New York, the courts provided a wedge for black suburbanization that open housing activists were not able to. Again, though, however, the combination of economic self-interest and identity drew blacks and propelled whites away from this suburban enclave. I could talk more, but I promised to go on for 45 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up. I could talk much more about the New Jersey Levittown, which is very interesting, but what I want to do for the next couple of minutes is just ask, what can we learn from the tale of Levittown, or the story of the three Levittowns, two done really briefly and one done at more length. I'm going to make just a few points. First, only a tiny handful of northern whites, most of them religious or political radicals, had anything more than a rhetorical commitment to integration. And when their moral vision of equality, what they professed, at least in terms of belief, clashed with their perceived self-interest, their self-interest won out in almost all the cases. Next, the Levittown story is a reminder of the ways in which the struggle to open housing had and still has a class problem, or a problem dealing with the fundamentally intertwined inequalities of race and class. The Quakers saw the issue of opening up Levittown. The NAACP worked to open up Levittown, not as a way of dealing with the structural inequalities caused by suburbanization that I began my talk with, but rather as an effort to change the hearts and minds of white Americans. To that end, they went for bourgeois, respectable African Americans, those who wouldn't be threatening to the status quo. In this vision, poor and working class blacks were entrapped in a dysfunctional culture and couldn't be helped by racial integration except for over the long run, as suburban middle-class blacks could serve as role models for them, gradually lifting them upward toward respectability. This emphasis on class had some unanticipated consequences for the effort to open up housing in the period after the Levittown battles. For one, it left untouched the spatial causes of racial inequality. For peppering the suburbs with model African Americans would not fundamentally change the spatial unequal relationships that kept African Americans in a subservient status to whites in post-Second World War II America. Second, and equally importantly, the strategy of trying to open up the suburbs to well-to-do African Americans alienated a rising generation of black activists and intellectuals who by the beginning of the 1960s began to revolt against the racial liberalism of the post-Second World War II period. The limitations of the open housing movement, at best peppering suburbs with a few token African Americans, led a growing number of black intellectuals and activists to reject the strategy of persuasion, the Myrdalian strategy of persuasion and conversion. And indeed, it led many to begin challenging the very idea of racial integration itself. By 1963, a survey of black public opinion in the North revealed deep skepticism about open housing efforts, even as African Americans continued to support the ideal of residential integration. They began to reject, above all, the rationale that racial liberals, the activists who had struggled to open up housing in the 1940s and 50s, had offered. As Stokely Carmichael in the mid-1960s would memorably put it, integration reinforces among blacks and whites, and here I'm paraphrasing, integration reinforces among both blacks and whites the idea that white is automatically better and black is by definition inferior. In looking at the battle to open up housing in this critical moment, this Cold War moment, this moment in the 1940s and especially in the 1950s, we have to grapple with the paradox that despite extraordinary changes, especially changes in whites' professed attitudes about integration and housing, despite those changes, that the boundaries, the municipal, geographic boundaries, the division of our metropolitan areas into racialized spaces remained deeply rooted in the North throughout this period. The invisible lines that divided our metropolitan areas, that shape our perception of cities and people, shape our perceptions of ourselves, shape the way that we distribute resources politically, shape how we're educated, shape our access and opportunity to jobs, all of those remained fundamentally unaddressed. When we look onto the history of post-Second World War, indeed modern American efforts to deal with racial inequality, we have to deal with the fact that racial and economic inequalities have been inscribed onto the geography of our metropolitan areas. Or to put differently, the spatial organization of our metropolitan areas creates and reinforces the subordination of African Americans. The lesson of the three Levittowns, perhaps, finally, is that challenging segregation requires getting at what is one of the most fundamental aspects of racial inequality in the United States, a lesson that was not learned by the civil rights activists of the Cold War generation and hasn't been learned by most of us today. And that is that it takes more than goodwill. It takes more than good intentions to undermine racial equality. It takes more than just efforts to get whites to think differently or talk differently about African Americans. It took more than the education, the persuasion, and the conversion that were the tactics of the civil rights activists of the post-Second World War II era. To achieve racial equality, to undermine racial inequality, takes power. For, as the great philosopher and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr argued, that even when we consider people of goodwill, the majority of whites will not give up the privileges of skin color unless they are forced to do so. The persistent racial inequality that characterizes metropolitan America, then, is one of the legacies of the limitations of a certain vision of post-Second World War II civil rights activism. On one hand, we see the creative power of strategies by civil rights activists to challenge the status quo and to forge coalitions to foster change. But at the same time, we see the power of the social, economic, and racial inequalities that continue to constrain and limit those struggles. The result, as the Levittown story shows, and as the story of the battle to open housing in the North shows, I will field questions, comments, provocations, etc. So please.
Please step up to the microphone with your questions so they can be heard by everyone.
Though you just touched upon it late, I was curious, you mentioned statistics roughly that initially in New Jersey, that the proportion of blacks was increased to a little more significant number. I think 30% is what you indicated, and then in a later time up to 50. I was just really curious, was it the change in law and the taking of that change in law to kind of push for the opportunity to bring African Americans into those suburbs that was responsible for the increase in those numbers? And if it were 30%, what were the relationships like between the 70% whites and the 30% blacks?
It's a great question. There's a sociology graduate student who recently reached out to me who said that he's working, he was working on a dissertation going back and doing interviews with people who lived in the Willingboro and other Levitt towns. I don't have a lot of material on the actual way that race relations played out. What became very clear in this suburb and in many other suburbs that were undergoing racial transition as more African Americans moved in is that the demographies began to shift in quite significant ways. That is, the white population gets older, few white families move in, and more African Americans with young children move in, so that in the process of shift from being all white or majority white to majority African American, the schools tilt over and become heavily African American first, and that what we perceive as integration in some ways are just longtime older white residents without families clinging on and eventually disappearing. Another version of this story, and actually I write about one of the most extraordinarily interesting efforts that happens just a few miles from Levittown at a place called Concord Park in Pennsylvania. It's a developer named Morris Milgram. He's a socialist and labor activist in the 1930s who becomes a very unlikely suburban housing developer in the 1940s and 1950s. And Milgram has a vision that comes out of his work in civil rights during the war and afterwards to create America's model interracial suburbs. And he starts to build them in various places. And Concord Park, just outside of Levittown, is one of them. He even hires Levitt's interior decorator to do the model houses for his Concord Park. And this is one of these places where some of the difficulties of racial integration became very clear. Huge numbers of people went to look at the Concord Park houses, but it was really hard to find whites who wanted to move in because African Americans were eager to have the opportunity to live in what they believed would be an integrated suburban housing development, and whites didn't. So what Milgram ended up doing was creating a quota system where they wouldn't sell houses to more than a certain number of African Americans until they sold them to whites. The result was a community that was 55-45 by the end of the 1950s. In the late 1990s, the last white resident of Concord Park died off or retired and went to a retirement community, and Concord Park became an all-black community. The process was much more extended in Concord Park than it was in Willingboro, Levittown, or in Southfield, Michigan, or in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, or some other suburbs that underwent the transition from being mostly white to mostly black in a short period of time. But it nonetheless showed some of the dynamics at work, which is that whites were unwilling, by and large, to commit to living in racially integrated communities, even well-meaning liberal ones like the ones that Milgram had recruited to live in Concord Park. So these issues of racial integration proved to be very vexing ones, not just in the obvious places like Levittown, but also in some of the most promising places like Concord Park. Just take a very quick aside on Milgram. In the late 1950s, he tried to build an integrated suburban community in Deerfield outside of Chicago and hit a whirlwind. The model houses were actually up, the infrastructure was laid, and the Park Commission in Deerfield condemned Milgram's 2 subdivisions for much needed parkland, even though voters in Deerfield had several times in the preceding couple of years voted down bonds to build city parks, because who needed parks? They all have lawns and swim clubs and so on. But when Milgram proposed to build one of his suburban housing developments there, and a pretty high-end one at that, there was really fierce resistance, leading to a long and prolonged court battle and eventually burning Milgram out and turning him to kind of easier to build apartment developments, mostly in cosmopolitan cities, New York and Washington, that wouldn't meet that kind of resistance again. So these were hard fought, very hard fought, and often not very successful battles.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. Well, maybe one is more of a comment, and that is that the whites who moved in to integrate neighborhoods generally faced less physical and emotional damage and danger than the blacks. So the inequality in terms of danger, I guess, is to me remarkably different for whites than blacks. That's kind of the comment. Mm-hmm. Then the question is, as you say, the complexity of this whole picture in post-war America is profound, but I want to complicate it a little bit more by asking you about the mobility between North and South. Say, for example, a lot of people in Southern Illinois are from Mississippi, and there's continuing, for the last several generations, this back and forth movement. And on the one hand, it strikes me as a blurring of the North and South divide, but it also, I wonder how that impacts the integration issues in a locale, say, in one place or another, if you have family rooted in Greenville, Mississippi, who are moving back and forth. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. There wasn't a lot of moving back and forth until the 1970s, not much before that, because if you're an African American who's migrated to a major metropolitan area in the north, you're not about to turn tail and head back into the maelstrom of battles against Jim Crow and what was still, in many respects, a pretty grim economy, even in booming southern municipalities where it was hard to get access to the kinds of jobs that blacks had access into the north. The 70s and beyond is a different story, where you do see a significant return migration of African Americans to the south. What impact that has on the prospects for racial integration in the north in the 1970s and beyond, I'm not sure. African Americans in general are pretty mobile, and I don't know that African Americans are any more mobile in terms of leaving the region than white Americans were. And I'm not sure that even if they were more mobile as a hypothetical, that it would necessarily have that much of an impact on the micro housing patterns of local real estate markets. I think the more significant reality in northern metropolitan areas, and this is shown by, and I write extensively about open housing after Levittown. I told you this is really a shard of my project. In the 1970s and 1980s and beyond, there were still all sorts of mechanisms, most of them skirting the bounds of legality, that restricted choice for African Americans in metropolitan housing markets. I just finished doing some research in Euclid, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, which had 0.1 or 0.2% African Americans in its population in 1970. It's about 40% African American now. But African Americans, and it was well documented by local fair housing organizations in the 1970s and 80s, were steered. That is, they were directed towards predominantly African American sections of the town, and whites were steered either to predominantly white parts of Euclid or out of Euclid altogether to nearby suburbs by real estate agents in what was a marginally illegal practice, but one that was extraordinarily difficult to prove and to detect. Fair housing groups would send out match pairs of testers, blacks and whites, and there sometimes you could trip up a real estate agent. But look, when I was house hunting in my racially integrated section of Northwest Philadelphia, when I bought my first house there 12 years ago or 14 years ago, our lovely white real estate agent used the phrase, do your neighborhood research, when we wanted to go see a house that was on the market that looked really appealing to us in a particular section of the neighborhood. She didn't say anything about the demography. She didn't say anything about who lived nearby or the schools or anything else. She just said, do your neighborhood research. But we knew exactly what she meant by do your neighborhood research. It didn't require a rocket scientist to read between the lines. So those kinds of practices, steering by real estate agents, well documented, continue to restrict choices for African Americans, as well as, and this is shown by survey researchers in the 80s and 90s, the perception of communities being hostile also kept African Americans out. These stories of hostility shocked many northern whites, but northern blacks had, in their family histories, in their histories of their friends or neighbors, lots of versions of stories like this. They were well known, they circulated widely, and they circulated through the black press in particular, and reminded folks of the craziness and insanity of moving to communities where they would face angry mobs or cross-burnings or just the cold shoulder of hostility from their white neighbors. And so many communities, as a consequence, were avoided by African-American homebuyers. Yes?
I appreciated your talk. Excuse me. You very clearly define what the problem, the historical basis of the problem. What's the solution?
That's a good question. the solution has to happen on a number of different levels, but I think the most important are what housing activists would call pro-integrative housing policies. Housing integration, it became very clear in this period, just doesn't happen by itself, of the goodwill of white people, or the market is structured in such a way that makes racial integration happening a very slim likelihood. There are a number of racially mixed communities around the country. They have, not surprisingly, been subjected to a lot of close scrutiny by scholars. And I'll just mention a couple of them really briefly because they're of different types. Perhaps the most promising and interesting one is outside of Chicago. A Supreme Court case, Hills v. Gautreaux, the Gautreaux case, or Gautreaux v. Hills, depending on which court it was in at which particular time, challenging racial isolation and segregation in the Chicago Housing Authority, required the Chicago Housing Authority to make vouchers available to public housing authority eligible people to move into private rental housing in suburban communities. It's a perfect controlled experiment. Social scientists love Gautreaux because you've got two groups who basically come from the same socioeconomic status, both come out of the public housing pool, one group of which moved to surrounding suburbs, the other group of which stayed in Chicago. And the outcomes by every measure show that the folks who took advantage of the voucher system did better educationally, economically, and so forth. That's one way to give folks an opportunity to break into housing markets that might otherwise not be open to them, or they might not be aware of being open to them. Next is an urban case, and it's the neighborhood that I live in Philadelphia called Mount Airy. I write about Mount Airy, unfortunately only briefly because my book is huge, but Mount Airy was a bastion of civil rights activism beginning in the 1950s. A figure who shows up in my first book on Detroit, who was the head of the Mayor's Interracial Commission on Detroit, moves to Philadelphia because he gets canned by Detroit's conservative Republican mayor in the 1950s, and moves to this neighborhood, Mount Airy, which is right in the path of racial transition. The nearby neighborhood of Germantown has become mostly African American, and blacks are beginning to move into Mount Airy. And Shermer, this activist, and a group of black and white activists from around the community work through churches and community organizations to create a kind of, you could say, an ideal racially integrated community, and they succeed. They succeed for all sorts of quirky reasons. Philadelphia has a residency requirement for city employees. The housing stock is amazing, and so lowly academics like me can live in giant big stone mansions. It became the kind of the Berkeley or Ann Arbor of Philadelphia, and it attracted lots of crunchy granola heads. We have one of the oldest running food co-ops in the country. It became a bastion of Reconstructionist Judaism, and so you have left-wing Jews who are there. So a whole series of circumstances, some by design, some by accident, created what remains, 50 years almost after the first African Americans moved in, a pretty diverse community. But it takes continued grassroots community activism and the fostering of connections, particularly between black and white community organizations, which is hard work. As the former president of my community organization, I can attest to that. The racial divisions in communications and politics play out even maybe more intensely among folks who are black and white who are trying to accomplish these goals. Third example, Shaker Heights, which is a relatively wealthy suburb of Cleveland, and Oak Park outside of Chicago is a similar case. There, the city government has done all sorts of things to prevent resegregation of neighborhoods, most notably continually redrawing elementary school enrollment zones so that you don't have the black elementary school and 3 white elementary schools, or however many there are. I can't remember the exact number right now. It's basically a form of public policy that tries to mitigate the consequences of racial segregation. Oak Park actually set up a system to try to assuage white fears that blacks moving in would lower their real estate values by offering a sort of insurance, basically saying that if your property falls in value more than a certain amount, we'll cover the difference. To the best of my knowledge, I've never been called on one of those policies, but ways basically of trying to engineer the system a little bit to integrate. Finally, the big enchilada and the most impractical, but probably the most crucial, and impractical I say because the Supreme Court basically made it impossible after 1974, and that's efforts to break down the boundaries between school districts, which become the most important determinant of political locality and resources. Milliken v. Bradley, 1974 Supreme Court case, the most important civil rights case after Brown versus Board of Education, in my opinion, involving Detroit. 53 school districts in metropolitan Detroit were to be part of an inter-district system, basically making it impossible for whites to leap over municipal or school district boundaries and flee racial diversity. Didn't work because the Supreme Court ruled that the suburbs can't be held responsible for remedying something that they weren't officially the cause of, or their official state action wasn't the cause of. But if you take a look in the South, in large metros like Charlotte, which was the subject of another Supreme Court case, Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg, there's a giant school district that encompasses the entire metropolitan area that made it impossible for whites to jump across boundaries and flee integration. That took a lot of management, and in the 1990s, largely as a consequence of the influx of northern whites who were freaked out at this system of integration, Charlotte started to be rolled back. But it stands as a stark contrast to Detroit. The metropolitan areas couldn't be more different in terms of the degrees of racial integration in education, which is but that's a big one, and that's maybe a longer term, and given the intense opposition to even regional cooperation over public policy issues, a really difficult one to achieve in our balkanized northern metropolitan areas, but one to keep on, at least in our vision of what we think the future should look like for metropolitan America. Yes?
I wanted to ask the question as far as economics goes. My parents, grandparents all came up from Tennessee, and so we're talking about slavery, where they weren't paid. Then they came up here to get jobs where they got very little pay, to kind of pass that, torch on where there's no economics to, say, build credible businesses and different things of that nature. And we still see that today. Living here in Southwest Champaign, I'm seeing a lot of, malls and different things come up, but the north end of town, they tore down the projects, so that made kind of that community scatter. So it took away our vote, it took away the economics that we probably could have had, and although there were problems, which I'm listening to you, I think they call that white flight, where there are people who are afraid of African Americans because of certain things that they do, and the fear, so they leave. But when they leave, the money goes. Right. And so we're left to try to figure out how we're going to do all of this, but we don't have the money to do it. I think I talked to you earlier today that even, no offense to North Koreans, but they have this, or whoever it is, that has the black hair care product market sold up. So we can't even get black hair care products, and if we do, we have to buy them from them, right. And they've cornered the market. So what I'm saying is, how do we deal with the economics? Because some of us would like to have businesses, some of us would like to have a mall on the north end. There's no banks there.
That's right.
There's banks out here everywhere. But there's no banks there. There's not a grocery store. There's not a place where young people can go and maybe start to learn about, respect and different things of that nature. So it's like we're kind of left to our own devices, and so the money goes where the white folks go.
That's right.
And that's, so what do we do about that in 2007?
Yeah, I don't know the story in this particular set of towns very well, but what I can say, based on my experience living in a racially diverse neighborhood in Northwest Philadelphia, it's a majority black neighborhood, and I've been involved in community economic development and community politics ever since I lived there. Our zip code by income is the third richest zip code in the city of Philadelphia. It might be fourth now because parts of Center City have gotten really rich in the last few years, but it's actually a heterogeneous community, but the average income is pretty high. Our little neighborhood downtown has not attracted the kind of investment that similarly situated neighborhoods in racially homogeneous suburbs or even racially homogeneous sections of the nearby city have attracted. Because business owners whether they be national chains or small local businesses, are deeply suspicious of investing in places where you see black faces on the streets day or night. So one of the local businesses I was involved in when I was the head of our local community organization, some really great people who are kind of 60s types who've bought this great old theater and a bunch of storefronts in the main business district, approached a local kind of well-known liberal bakery, coffee house kind of place called Levis. If somebody from Philadelphia will know Levis. They're kind of Scientologists or something, so I shouldn't say that, it's on TV, but putting that to the side, this small business said, we're not going to be the first. Get somebody else here first. Get someone to come in front of me, and then we'll come along if we think it works. But they're fundamentally cautious, and I think ultimately when you're taking a look at questions of community economic development investment, the issue is follow the money. Where is the money going? And neighborhoods that are racially diverse and or racially homogeneous with large minority populations generally see investment drain away with really devastating long-term consequences. So you get oftentimes really marginal businesses, check cashing agencies that charge exorbitant fees to get your check cashed on a workday. Banks vanish, check cashing agencies come in. We have in Philadelphia Stop and Goes, which are these little neighborhood shops that sell 6-packs of beer for pretty high prices or 40s that spring up in these sorts of marginal places. These aren't the kinds of businesses that a strong community relies on or rests on, but they're there because investment goes the way of whites. It moves the great white way, mostly to suburban places. Even suburban places aren't as well off as ours. And so this is a major problem. It's one that's been addressed partially by efforts to channel federal and state and local money into local community development, but by and large those programs have been underfunded and not very well designed or managed and haven't really had a very significant impact on transforming, but pressuring, coming up with policies to encourage more investment in those kinds of neighborhoods, especially job-generating investment, I think is an important public policy. It's one that activists in the 1960s pointed to, even if they didn't always or usually get the way that they wanted. Yep.
Hi, my name is Beth. I grew up in Massachusetts, and during my junior high school history years, I learned that there's a lot of bad stuff that happened in the South, and the North came in and helped everybody out. So if there was any racial disparity around me, I knew it couldn't be because we in Massachusetts were racist because we had cleared all that up. In fact, had saved the rest of the country from that. You spoke, when you talked about public opinion poll in 1970 and how white folks had said, 70% or whatever said, oh yeah, it'd be great to have a black neighbor, and yet their behavior wasn't commensurate with that. You said something at that time that I think you probably have a more solid answer for. You said, well, maybe they weren't willing to respond to the pollsters accurately to what they really thought. It's been my experience that, well, they probably were honest, but they didn't realize some of the assumptions they were making. So it'd be fine to have a black neighbor as long as they, as you said, tend your garden, i.e. as long as they're behaving in a cultural way that's commensurate with me and along class lines. And because I work in a school, and I see a lot of the marginalization that happens and the malignment of, it's not because this child is black that I'm putting them in the behavior disorder classroom. It's because X, Y, or Z, some other reason. So I'm hoping you could speak more to that failure to observe in oneself the alignment with racialization and other things like class and non-whiteization.
Yeah. Your observations are good ones. It became increasingly unacceptable over the course of the 40s through the 70s for whites to express overt racial prejudices. When you hear, city council meetings on locations of public housing projects circa 1940 or circa 1945, white folks are right out there with their racial sentiment. They wear them on their sleeves. They're unabashed in expressing their resentment of African Americans. You still see some of that in the 1960s and 1970s. It doesn't completely go away, but there are ways of masking it with positions that are ostensibly race neutral but aren't really. And one finds this especially around the conflation of questions of race and class. You know, the white assumption is that African Americans don't move to most white suburbs because they don't have the class status to do so. And that if they only work hard enough and pull themselves up into the middle class, then the suburban dream will be open to them as well. Well, every major sociological study of housing and housing markets shows that African Americans can afford to live in a huge range of different types of suburbs, that it's not, by and large, economic status that's keeping African Americans from moving into those communities. It's something else. Whites aren't, in other words, perceiving the the class and economic diversity of African American communities. The perception among whites when an African American moves in is the perception shaped by media images of blacks: poor, dangerous, criminal. And poor becomes shorthand for a larger set of racial attributes that dare not speak their name in polite company or polite discourse. And so there are ways, in other words, in which our emphasis on cleaning up our talk, in changing our discourse on race, and indeed changing our attitudes about race, has led to other ways of racial difference expressing or manifesting itself. But above all, the ways that we talk about race, the individual and moral ways that we talk about race, and this is not exclusive to whites. A lot of civil rights activists, African American groups, Black Power organizations demanded a change in the hearts and minds of white Americans in the 1960s and 70s too. That was where they believed the struggle lay. It diverts our attention from the ways in which racial difference is structured economically, that it's built into the way markets are organized, that it's built into the kinds of privileges that come from a racially stratified workforce, the way that it's built into the way that we organize our politics by place, by neighborhood, right? So that you can say, I'm choosing to live in this posh suburb outside of Philadelphia. It just happens to be all white, but that's just because of natural market forces at work. So we naturalize the processes that lead to racial inequality rather than trying to look them straight on. And so pedagogically, when I'm teaching my undergraduates, I have students who say, I'm not a racist. And okay, fine, I'm cool with that. You're not a racist. But I'm not going to impugn you with, harboring deep, dark, negative feelings towards people with a skin color different than your own. Cool. But in some ways, that's not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is that the way our school districts are structured, there are radically different forms of education that predominantly black school districts are able to give their children and predominantly white school districts on average are able to give theirs. There are radically different political goods and resources available to people living in one community versus living in another community. And that perpetuates racial inequality, and that's racialized even if it's not the sum of lots of individual acts of hatred. And that's a process that really needs to be made visible rather than remaining in the quiet and invisible.
Well, I want to thank Kahn very much for his talk today.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. It was very stimulating.